Ministry program, retiring about 4 years ago. And thank you very much, Dr. Smallwood, for the welcome. Thank you, A&T, for hosting this kickoff event and this day of activities. Just by way of explanation, this is the bicentennial of the first known activity on the Underground Railroad, or what became known as the Underground Railroad, in Guilford County, probably in North Carolina, when in 1819, Vestal Coffin, a member of the Quaker community in New Garden, 9 miles down the road that way, enabled John Demery, a free black who was kidnapped and was about to be taken into slavery, to escape Guilford County and get to Indiana on what became the route of the Underground Railroad. Vestal Coffin was born on October 10th, 1792, and died on October 10th, 1826. So October 10th is a significant date. And I first became aware of that significance and of Vestal Coffin's grave in the New Garden Cemetery next to the Quaker meeting that my wife and I are members of there across from the Guilford College campus. When Travis Mangum, up there operating the camera, walked from the A&T neighborhood to New Garden on October 10th, I believe it was 2012, to visit the grave of Vestal and his wife Alethea Coffin, to commemorate his significance in the history of North Carolina. He's done that a couple other times. Any of you willing to do that today? He'd be happy to accompany you in that 9-mile trip.
But we're not doing that?
A&T is next to a neighborhood just south of the campus called the Benjamin Benson neighborhood. Benjamin Benson was another free black who was kidnapped in 1817, sold into slavery to a businessman in Greensboro. And Vestal Coffin and 2 other Quakers from New Garden aided him in the court system for 3 years to finally win his freedom in 1820. And through the Benjamin Benson neighborhood next to the campus runs John Demery Road. So what an appropriate place to begin this day of commemoration of Vestal Coffin and that history at A&T next to the Benjamin Benson neighborhood and John Demery Road. The activities today after Dr. Smallwood's presentation will continue at noon down at the Benjamin Benson Historical Marker. Any of you know where that is? I see 2 hands. 3 hands. It's on February 1 Plaza. Another significant connection with A&T, between the Melvin Municipal Building and the Civil Rights Museum. And there's a marker there commemorating the history of Benjamin Benson's 3-year battle with the court system here and in Georgia, with the assistance of Vestal Coffin, Enoch Macy, and George Swain to win his freedom. There'll be a presentation there at noon, all invited, by Jeff Thigpen, the Register of Deeds, who some of you may know organized the Slave Deeds of Guilford County exhibit several years ago, and will share about that history and about Benjamin Benson and his significance in our local history. After that, folk can wander about, grab something to eat, walk with Travis all the way over to New Garden. And at 3 o'clock, there will be a tour to what we call the Underground Railroad tree in the old New Garden Woods, now part of the Guilford College campus. That woods was used as a sanctuary for fugitives from enslavement, even before there was an Underground Railroad. Reading the journals of Levi Coffin and other early Quaker farmers there, they talked about fugitives escaping the terrible situation they were in, hiding out in those woods until either the situation changed or eventually, after 1819, they could get on the road to freedom. And that path to the woods and into the Underground Railroad tree has become part of the national park systems Pathway to Freedom. It's on the, what's the official title of it? Network to Freedom. So it's now historically recognized nationally. Those interested in joining us for that walk at 3 o'clock, Guilford College campus, Nathan Hunt Road, just past the lake, and on the left is the trailhead, and we'll take you back to the tree. So again, Nathan Hunt Road on the Guilford College campus, just past the lake on the left. After that visit at 4:30 this afternoon, we will tour briefly the graveyard at New Garden Friends meeting where Vestal Coffin and his wife Alethea are buried. And we'll complete the day with a visit there and to other sites in that graveyard that are connected with the history of human rights and social justice, the civil rights movement, the Underground Railroad, the grave of George Swain, as well as the coffins, the grandparents of Levi Coffin, who eventually became known as the president of the Underground Railroad, and his work with this massive interracial civil disobedience movement that we are commemorating this year. And that's at 801 New Garden Road, right next to the Guilford College campus. So lots of activity today, all of it commemorating that historical event in 1819 when Vestal Coffin and John Demery conspired to address the evils of slavery and the possibility of freedom. And after John Demery, hundreds, if not thousands, from this area went to freedom along that route into Ohio and Indiana. So we're looking forward to hearing Dr. Smallwood's presentation about the origins of that system. And I'll be available afterwards around all that good food out there that is courtesy of the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro, who has funded this year's commemorative activity. So do them honor and eat lots and lots of pastries and drink lots and lots of coffee out there. And I'll be available to give you further instructions or directions for other events today. But thank you much for coming. Thank you again, A&T. Thank you, Julia, for helping set all this up. Thank you, Dr. Smallwood. We look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Carter, but Max, but I want to thank you for again, involving North Carolina A&T in this program and allowing me to kind of kick things off. I'm going to turn the lights down and then start into the presentation, so I'm going to turn the lights down for a second. So the title of my presentation this morning is Early Origins of the Underground Railroad, Relations Between Africans, Native Americans, and Quakers. And it's going to be hard for me to say Max, I'm going to always say Dr. Carter. But as Dr. Carter laid out, the Underground Railroad really, you know, in the relationship between A&T with civil and human rights, and we talk about sit-ins, etc. People tend to think about these movements, you know, as more recent events. You know, we kind of start our histories with slavery, and then we ended antebellum slavery at that, and then we kind of move into the civil rights movements. And many students of history, that tends to be what they want to study and what they tend to study. But it's important to understand that our state and our nation has a history that was involved enslaved people for 200 years, roughly, before the establishment of the Republic, before the creation of the United States of America. The English had been here, they had worked with the Native Americans, they had enslaved Native peoples as well as African peoples. They mixed peoples on plantations, and peoples found other ways to collaborate and work together. So this was an institution that had been in place for quite some time. So by the time we get to the time of Levi Coffin, there has been hundreds of years of interactions between peoples, native peoples, African peoples, and Quakers. And I don't know that many people understand that relationship and realize that the Quakers were heavily involved with the native peoples of North Carolina, even back into the 1600s. The Quakers and their involvement with native groups and African groups was not new. It had been ongoing for many, many generations. What was new was that they had developed settlements here in the Piedmont and had continued their activities as it pertains to people. The Iroquois who interacted with them called the Quakers and William Penn Brother Onus. And basically it was a sign of respect for their treatment of native peoples. In most Quaker settlements as well as Moravian settlements, and we know the Moravians over in Forsyth County, you often found Indian, African, and white peoples living together, worshiping together, praying together, and when they died, being buried together. They were not segregated. They were all mixed together. And you can go to cemeteries, particularly in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, for the Moravians, and you'll see examples of this throughout Pennsylvania and New York State and into eastern Ohio in the early period, prior to the antebellum period. So I want to start the presentation, and I wanted you to kind of, to give that background, because I want you to understand that this is an old history. So what I'm talking about is an old history that is documented, but not really written about, because we tend to focus, like I said again, on the late middle antebellum period, the period just before the end of slavery and the American Civil War. So I'm going to talk about Native Americans, Africans, and slavery in colonial North Carolina. And so I'm going to start and be brief with first contact. So it's important to understand that from first contact, and this is a drawing, of course, by John White and Ralph Lane in 1584, when they mapped eastern North Carolina. And if you read maps pretty well, you can clearly see the outer banks of North Carolina. You have to turn the map sideways. If you turn it sideways, you'll be able to see the outer banks of North Carolina. You'll be able to see Roanoke Island. You'll be able to see the Chuan, the Albemarle Sound, the Chuan and Roanoke Rivers. The point of this is that from earliest times, in the 1580s, what we see is that there is an understanding of native peoples in North Carolina and in the North Carolina region. And we have very detailed maps of the coastal areas of North Carolina. That's that same map turned sideways and showing the rest of the northeast coast up through Virginia and up to New York State. So we had a very good understanding of the different peoples that would here in the Americas when we have first contact between the English and the native peoples that are here. And in North Carolina and Virginia, you had, of course, the Powhatan Confederacy, which was made up of a number of different Algonquin-speaking peoples, including the Nazmen, the Chesapeakes, the Powhatans proper, but also the Mattaponi, the Pamunkeys. And then down in North Carolina, the largest group being the Tuscarora, but also a number of other groups in eastern North Carolina, including the Cholanokes, the Neuse, the Hatteras, the Roanoke, and other Indian groups that were in eastern North Carolina. So as the English began to explore the region and come into the region and settle it, initially attempting to settle Roanoke Island in Virginia, in North Carolina, but failing because native peoples were not very hospitable to their arrival there, we're going to see changes already being made even in the colonial period. So even in the 1580s and the early 1600s, we have these changes as a result of Indian African slavery and white indentured servitude. I'm going to be very brief with this, but I think as a historian and as someone who does early American history and someone who's talking about the Underground Railroad today and kind of kicking off this event, it's important to understand that the first Africans were brought here by the English, Sir Francis Drake, in 1586, a year before the first whites were brought to Roanoke Island in 1587. And so what we see is that there are many African people already in eastern North Carolina and already in the swamps of eastern North Carolina interacting with the native peoples of eastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia. I'm going to explain the relationship, and we're going to move more quickly. Right? The point is, the first peoples that are enslaved in North America are actually Indians. This is their native land. They know the land very well. They know the backcountry of the land. They know the trading paths between their enemies and their allies. Roads that we travel on today, like 64, 264, 70, 52, 29, US 1, 15, 15501, 17, and through the Mountain Valley, the Appalachian Valley, Shenandoah Valley, 11, which is now Interstate 81. Indians knew these trade routes. They knew their neighbors, knew them well. Some were their enemies, some were their allies, but they interacted and they traded with people and traveled frequently throughout their landscape. So when the English moved into the landscape and they begin the process of taking land from native people, one of the first things they are doing is also taking native peoples. They're taking their women and children and they're selling them into slavery. The masters are taking their women for their wives. They are breeding the women with white indentured servants who they forcibly brought from Europe, and then they're layered on top of by Africans that come into the area as well. As I said, these Indians understand the routes very well. 11, which runs through the valley of Shenandoah, it was called the Great Warrior Path. It was a great Seneca path. It came down from Seneca, New York, all the way down the valley into what we call Knoxville and on down even as far as Chattanooga. The Five Nations waged war on the Cherokees in the mountains and down in Tennessee. And they also waged war on other groups that they were enemies. And the Tuscaroras, who were in North Carolina, since they were Iroquois and part of the Iroquois Confederacy, they basically maintained their economic and trading ties with the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina. So when we start talking about the origins of the Underground Railroad, you cannot leave out of this narrative Native Americans. As I point out to people all the time, much of what we in North Carolina accept as our culture, even our foodways, when we talk about corn, beans, and squash, butter beans, kidney beans, black-eyed peas, snaps, tobacco, which built the state of North Carolina, all of these things were introduced to the Europeans, to the English, by the Native Americans. None of the crops existed in Europe. Three Sisters didn't exist in Europe. Tobacco did not exist in Europe. They learned about these things from native people, as did the Africans who were brought later and blended with the native people on plantations throughout North Carolina and throughout the South. So it's important to understand that most of these early native people, like the Muchapungas, the Bear River Indians, the Mattamuskeet, the Choanoks, the Harris, Core, Noose, Pamlico, Maharans, Nottaways, Nanticokes, Delawares, along the Atlantic seaboard are having interactions not only with whites and white indentured servants, but also with Africans. But the advantage that the Indian people have that the whites do not is that they know the landscape and they know the way. They know the way to freedom. So as white indentured servants were treated no better than African indentured servants. They were treated no better than Indian indentured servants. And so when the opportunity arose for white indentured servants to run away, they ran away to the Indians. And the Indians basically blended with them or intermixed with them throughout